So intertextuality versus allusion. An intertextual reference is a reference to another text within one text. It allows for a much broader range of understanding and a much broader range of symbolism and ideas within a text. We'll refer to the text making the references as the base text and the intertextual texts as those beyond. So our base text is the novel Wonder by R.J. Palacio, for example, as this is an excellent example of intertextuality in action. So when the author refers to Star Wars, this is an intertextual reference beyond the base text, and it allows us to think about images beyond the text we're studying and think about Star Wars as how it relates to the base text. Intertextual references can be films, comics, cartoons, advertisements, anything in popular culture, history, the Bible. It can be almost anything. An allusion in this context is a reference to something without making it explicit, and you can think of it as a passing reference. So rather than an intertextual reference, which might actually tell you what text is talking about and then give detail based on that, an allusion simply mentions maybe one character or one element of the plot or similar within the text. As such, allusions are a more subtle form of an intertextual reference in that they mention only one part of the text, and it requires you to have watched, seen, or viewed the text to know and to catch the allusion. So just looking at allusions briefly, there are four main types: biblical, literary, cultural, and historical. Though these could probably be synthesized into two, being cultural, historical, or literary, with biblical being underneath that. However, the Bible is such a pervasive text in our culture that it gets its own section. In regard to intertextuality, there are 8 types, however. And remember, there are references to all of the ideas I'm referring to and where they're from in the description of this video. The first form of intertextuality is revision. This is where you update the ideas or the moral or the lessons behind a story to more closely fit with the modern or the present time you live. A perfect example of this is fairy tales, where in the past they were more violent, now they are less violent, and the morals are more linked to concepts such as stranger danger and less physically threatening concepts like that. The second form is translation, which is, as it sounds, translating one text from its native tongue to a different tongue. This is most common obviously among popular texts. The third form is quotation, and this simply means inserting holus bolus, a whole part of a text, into another. This can be short, such as an essay, or it can be more extended, such as a poem or passage being inserted within a text. The fourth form is sources, which is where one text is based on the previous established plot, character, or structure of another text. And this can be accidental or on purpose. So it's often the case where literary analysis will say that a source of one text is another thing, but it's not even necessary for the author to be aware of that or to have read that text previously. This is especially true if the source is very well known and widely discussed in society, such as everyone probably knows the songs of the Beatles without necessarily having gone out of their way to hear it. In the same way, a well-known story within a culture, everyone will be aware of whether they've read it or not. A good example of this would be the Bible. You don't have to have read it to know about the Last Supper, for example. The fifth form is conventions and configuration. So for this, you're thinking almost elements based on genre. So you know in your certain type of genre, there needs to be a murder because it's true crime. And the structure will be that at the beginning, no one knows anything, and at the end, everyone knows everything, and the plot loops are hopefully tied off. And a true crime story that followed these conventions and configurations would be intertextual in that way. The sixth form is not that dissimilar to the previous, but it's genre. So again, genre limits much less than the previous overview. You can simply have similar themes or concepts within it. Something from the romance genre, for example, will involve love, but whether it's acted out or whether it's successful or whether they get married depends entirely on the story. The seventh form is paralogues. This is basically limited to literary analysis or the types of essays you write in high school. These texts critique, analyze, or record all of the references made within a text and pass some sort of judgment on them. And the eighth form is an original intertext. This is where the author makes reference to another text, but the text that they are referring to they have created themselves. And the best example of this would be someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, whose Lord of the Rings series involved languages he had created and references to texts that only he had read or that he had written. For a text such as this, a true fan can go and seek out these original texts which the author has created, but it's not necessary, and it can just add colour to the otherwise clear story. So a metaphor to understand intertextuality would be the World Wide Web. So you've got your base story, which is the centre of the web, and all the references you make outside of it are the webs that make up all the internet nodes. Another good metaphor is hyperlinks. So if all of the intertextual references were hyperlinked, such as in a multimedia text or a website, you could actually click on them and go through to the original intertext or the reference being made in case you didn't understand it. However, somewhat like a joke, if it needs to be explained to you, quite often the meaning is lost. And this is definitely true of intertextual references and allusions. If you don't get them, unless you're closely studying or analysing the text for a paralogue, it's probably better to just skim over it. So the key differences between allusions and intertextual references are quite subtle, and everyone has their own differences. But I would say allusions are typically brief, similar to a symbol as opposed to a metaphor. They might occur only once or twice, but as soon as they're ongoing or repetitive, they're more likely to be an intertextual reference. Secondly, they don't directly reference the text, and they only mention a character or a certain part of it. They can also be made accidentally, especially if the thing being referenced or alluded to is very well known in common culture. By contrast, an intertextual reference is similar to a motif in that it repeats and it runs throughout the story. It may also include the actual text title or name within it. It cannot be made accidentally, and if you are referring to another text and you haven't read it, this can easily be found out in the same way that using Wikipedia to finish an assignment is quickly found out and understood by anyone who actually has a thorough understanding on the subject. The power of allusions and intertextuality is quite clear, as I'll illustrate here. If you compare it to simple adverbs and adjectives to describe something, if I told you there was a man who was tall, with black hair, dressed in all black, you have some unclear images formed in your head and some characteristics rather than a full understanding of the person. However, if I use the same 4-word limit and I said hardcore Star Wars fan, instantly you have a much clearer and fully developed picture of this person as opposed to the tall man dressed in black and so on. So hopefully this has shown you how intertextuality and allusions can make your text richer and help you to locate them within texts that we're studying. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the effect of intertextual references and allusions. So this is where your opinion comes in. You could say that the more references within a text that are made by the author, the better the author is, in that they've done more research, they're more widely read than another author who has less references. By contrast, you could also say that an author without many textual references and who has based most of the ideas on their own concepts is a better author in that they are more creative and less reliant on the milieu of which they live in. That's for you to decide. However, one thing to consider is how many references are in a text and why. So it may be an author's style to use a lot of references where there's multiple within each chapter and they're many and they're varied. By contrast, there could be no references at all, or as in the case of Tolkien, they could have created their own references. And obviously this is most likely going to be happening in fantasy and science fiction, though it can happen in other genres. So then once you've analysed this, how many references, intertextual or otherwise, there are, you have to consider from where they're drawn. So if an author uses a lot of biblical references, that's a pretty big indication of something towards their background. If they use a lot of pop cultural references, again, that shows where they are situated in the world and what they value and what they look for. So the second effect is presumed knowledge. So this is similar to the persuasive technique, inclusive language, whereby by using these references, you're trying to make a connection with your author. You're trying to indicate that you and the reader, are together. You're one thing. It can also be used to try and indicate that you're in the know. So if you get this reference, then you are clever like me. And you could suggest this is why people read books, to show off, but again, that's where your opinion comes in. Does more references make you connect with the text more? But alternatively, if the readers and the audience are missing these references, then it's likely that they will be not as impressed by the text. So the third effect is that it allows for a richer text. Again, similar to the persuasive technique connotation, which allow for a much wider picture of images associated with keywords and phrases. Intertextual references can pull on whole fantasy worlds and entire understandings of key concepts, just with the mention of one single text. So when you're looking at an intertextual reference, it can indicate 3 main things about the text. Firstly, it's very likely to indicate something about the character, in that the character mentioned in the text will likely be a fan of it, or at least aware of its existence. Secondly, it tells you a lot about the author and the social milieu in which they live. So if they're referencing Taylor Swift, that indicates a certain time period. And if they're indicating a love of Justin Timberlake in his NSYNC days, again, that's a very different time period. And lastly, and thirdly, it can tell you about the setting of the text. Unless, of course, it's an anachronism, which is where you use a reference to something that didn't exist in the time, or that's incorrect in the current setting. So if you're writing a medieval story and one of the knights pulls out a AK-47, for example, then that's an anachronism in that it couldn't possibly have existed without some sort of a time travel narrative built into the story. So lastly, if we were going to describe me as a character, and we said firstly I was a Star Wars fan, that wouldn't indicate too much, but if I said further that I was a Star Trek fan, then you're starting to get much clearer pictures. And then perhaps if you said I played Dungeons and Dragons with my bearded friends in my basement, now you're starting to get much clearer images based on the intertextual evidence.